I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across the battlefront, ask why the German Air Force is ordering cruise missiles from the US, and Dom Nicholls interviews Colonel in the Security Service of Ukraine and Secretary of the Verkhovna Rada Committee on National Security, Roman Kostenko.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 20th of March, 2 years and 25 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dom Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, and Berlin Correspondent James Rothwell. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. I'm going to be leaping about geographically, so please hold on tight. But as we speak, Russia is thought to have launched an attack against the northeastern city of Kyiv, resulting in casualties, according to Mayor Ihor Terekhov. We think this attack started a couple of hours ago. There has been rumours or assessments for some weeks now that Kyiv might be the area where Russia pushes hard next. We know they have been still continuing to push up and down the line. Some movements there I'll speak about in a moment. But Kyiv, it's very close to the border and it's a major city, the second city of the country. It's been thought to be a much sought after prize for some time. So whether or not this is a major assault or limited raids, we don't know, but something seems to be happening at the moment in Kyiv. We will continue to look at that throughout the show now. I'll bring you updates at the end if we get anything, but this will obviously feature over the next few days, I imagine. Now, inside Russia, Ukrainian drones attacked the Engels air base deep inside Russian territory earlier today. This comes from a source in Ukrainian intelligence. The drones operated by Kyiv's GOR military intelligence agency, General Bogdanov's lot. This is a source speaking to Reuters, adding that Ukraine is still assessing the damage. But Roman Bazargin, who's the governor of Russia's Saratov region, where the base is located, appeared to partly corroborate the source's comments, saying that Ukrainian drones had been downed near the city of Engels. He did not report any damage. Engels is the main home of Russia's long-range strategic bomber fleet, located near the city of Saratov. It's about 750 k's southeast of Moscow, about 400 k's east of Ukraine, so a long, long way away. It has, however, been hit before. Ukraine used drones to hit it back in December. At the time, Russian authorities said that 3 people had died in that attack. No further updates about what's happened today. Now, still inside Russia, and Putin has ordered the FSB, the Federal Security Service, to track down Russian citizens who are fighting for Ukraine. The comments were made during a meeting with the FSB's board yesterday. Putin said all such Russians must be tracked down and, quote, punished without any statute of limitations wherever they may be located. You'll remember the Freedom of Russia Legion, the Siberian Battalion and the Russian Volunteer Corps, along with the Ishkarian Volunteers, which I spoke of yesterday, and thanks Olga for updating me on that. That group is Chechens opposed to Ramzan Kadyrov. They launched cross-border incursions into Russia's Belgorod and Kursk regions on March the 12th, so just over a week ago. They seem to be going on. Now, possibly linked to these ongoing operations, Ukraine has allegedly fired a number of missiles into Russia overnight, including what the Russian MOD say, so warning, salt mine, Russian MOD say a Patriot missile, which would be provocative because it's a US-made missile. Now, there is no other source for that, the allegation of a Patriot being used, other than Russia, so do treat with extreme caution, mark it and move on. Russia's defense ministry said that air defense units had intercepted a dozen rockets and missiles over Belgorod region by 10 p.m. local last night. Soon after, it said it had intercepted 2 more missiles over the neighbouring Kursk region, and that's the one where they said one of them was a US-made Patriot. As I say, no way of verifying that. No other evidence provided. Drones were also downed in the Saratov region. That's where the Engels Air Base is, bordering Kazakhstan. Comes from Russian defense officials. Now, back in Ukraine, engagements have continued up and down the line, in particular near Bakhmut, west and southwest of Donetsk city, in the Donetsk-Zaporizhia Oblast border area, in western Zaporizhia Oblast, and in the east, so the left bank of the Dnipro in Kherson Oblast yesterday. No confirmed changes to the front line, however. Russian forces reportedly unsuccessfully attacked near Kupiansk and Crimea, deep in the east, but no confirmed changes to the front line there. And Russian MOD say elements of their central grouping of forces seized Orlivka, a town about 5 km northwest of Avdiivka. Russian forces recently made a confirmed advance in that area. Geolocated footage from yesterday shows that Russian forces recently advanced on the northwestern edge of the Pervomaiska Dam. That's 5 km southwest of Avdiivka, same distance northwest of Donetsk city itself. And one Russian mill blogger, so you've got to treat with caution, but one Russian mill blogger is saying that Ukrainian forces conducted a reconnaissance in force near Russian positions north and northwest of Avdiivka. No further details on that. Now then, the next one, Ramstein. The Ramstein process, the Ukraine Defence Contact Group. It met yesterday at and again, thanks for correcting me, not the US Air Base in Ramstein, Germany, but it has an air base, NATO air base in Ramstein, Germany. Lloyd Austin, US Defense Secretary, said Russia has paid a staggering cost for Putin's imperial dreams. He said at least 315,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded since the start of the full-scale invasion. And he said Russia had squandered up to $211 billion to equip, deploy, maintain and sustain its imperial aggression against Russia. Sticking on the sort of more military diplomatic theme, Sergei Naryshkin, he's Russia's foreign intelligence chief, in response to recent comments by Macron and others, President Macron of France, Naryshkin said that any French troops sent to Ukraine would be a priority target, trying to set the narrative again, would be a priority target for Russian forces. That was reported by TASS, Russia's state-owned news agency.
I don't believe that at all. I think that's utter nonsense.
I think it would be. I mean, it doesn't matter. What does it mean? It doesn't matter. If there'd be a priority target. Anyway, maybe a discussion for another time. But Naryshkin is supposed to have said that a French contingent will become a priority and legitimate target for attacks by the Russian armed forces. This means that the fate of all Frenchmen who have ever come to the territory of the Russian world with a sword would await it. The fate of all what? I don't know what he means there. Anyway, I will remind you, remember Artis Pabriks, Latvia's defence secretary, who took me to task over the phrase I used about 18 months ago, legitimate target. Mr. Pabriks rightly said there are no legitimate targets in Ukraine. So Mr. Naryshkin going on about these would be legitimate, it's just rubbish. There are no legitimate targets for Russia in Ukraine. They should not be there. A couple more. Denis Shmyhal, Ukraine's prime minister, says his country hopes to have enough ammunition to start pushing back against the recent Russian advances from April. He was speaking as the Czech-led initiative, one of the 8 capability groups under the Ramstein process. So the Czech-led initiative to source ammunition for Ukraine has raised the funds to deliver hundreds of thousands of rounds, as we've reported. But Mr. Shmyhal was speaking at a news conference yesterday in Luxembourg on a visit. He said, "We hope that this Czech initiative, which Luxembourg joined, will help us. And beginning in April, we will have enough ammunition to deter our front line." I think it means sort of push back. Prague, you'll remember, this year located 800,000 artillery rounds on the open market with which to supply Ukraine, and has so far raised the funds to purchase the first batch of 300,000. And last one for me, David. Railway line trying to link Russia to Crimea. Putin plans to build this 450-mile railway line down the sort of land corridor, if you like, to Crimea. Needs it as a backup supply line, as the Kerch Bridge is the only way, other than by sea, to supply Crimea at the moment. So who's saying this? I think it was... Sorry, this is Putin. I've just been informed that the railway line from Rostov-on-Don, that's in Russia, to Donetsk, Mariupol and Berdyansk in Ukraine, obviously, has been rebuilt. Putin said, "We will continue this work and soon trains will ride all the way to Crimea and there'll be another alternative route in addition to the Crimean bridge." Now, It's not clear how much of the work has been done. Details have been out for some months now, but we don't know if it is complete. And that's certainly been contradicted. Ukraine has attacked and severely damaged the Kerch Bridge twice, you'll remember, since the full-scale invasion started. Road and rail traffic across the bridge is frequently disrupted, often by maritime drones, and the threat of further Ukrainian attacks. But a railway line would offer another way to supply Russian forces in Ukraine. But a fixed asset like that is very vulnerable, and we know that either Ukrainian partisans or special forces units have been very active down in that region around in the sort of southern Kherson Oblast, Zaporizhia, that area, blowing up trains and rail lines. And I'll take a pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for talking us through all of that. Francis, what's across your desk in the diplomatic and political spheres?
Well, thanks, David. Lots of diplomatic developments today. Perhaps most notable is that Vladimir Putin will travel to China in May for talks with its Premier Xi Jinping. 5 sources familiar with the matter told Reuters. The visit will, of course, be the Russian leader's first overseas trip of his new presidential term and a sign of the widening geopolitical fault lines that have opened since the start of the Ukraine war. As we reported yesterday, Western governments condemned Putin's so-called re-election as unfair and undemocratic, but nations such as China, India and North Korea congratulated him on extending his rule by a further 6 years. Another of the sources said Putin's trip to China would probably take place in the second half of May. 2 of the sources said that Putin's visit would come before the Chinese president's planned trip to Europe. Listeners will recall the olive branch extended by Xi when he visited Moscow in March last year, seen by many as symbolic of a deepening bond between the two as a result of the war, and sending a clear signal that Putin was coming in from the cold, as it were, after his initially being shunned by many countries following the invasion, as they hedged their bets as to whether it would see his downfall. But diplomatically, the Ukrainians are hard at work too. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Kuleba will visit India next week as Kyiv looks to build support for its peace plan, according to 2 Indian officials. New Delhi, which has traditionally had close economic and defence ties with Moscow, has so far refused to criticise Russia for the full-scale invasion, instead stepping up purchases of Russian oil to record levels. It has been noteworthy to see how Kyiv has reached out to many nations as a response to the war, including in the Middle East and Africa, as its international importance has grown, although tangible successes as a result of this outreach are harder to tell at this stage. They may well be seeds that will take months, years, decades to properly germinate. But nonetheless, it has been interesting seeing Zelensky and others travelling all over in a way that they may not have were it not for the war. The shifting geopolitical tectonic plates as a result of the conflict indeed are being registered everywhere, something we've spoken about many times. Sometimes we've given attention to the Balkans. And in that vein, I recommend listeners check out an interview our very own defence editor Danielle Sheridan has done with the Prime Minister of Kosovo, who argues in that video interview and in print that Britain and other Western countries should send more troops to Kosovo to prevent war in the region, as the current NATO presence is not enough, he argues, to prevent an invasion by Moscow's ally Serbia, which he and others argue is being encouraged by the Kremlin to stoke unrest in the hope of drawing attention and resources away from Ukraine. Listeners will know my own feelings on this. I think that any areas Putin can probe and provoke must be considered a target at this stage, and that requires proactive rather than reactive measures. Russia has influence in many countries and regions, and we neglect them at our peril. History suggests Putin securing another 6 years in office will only embolden him. Evidence for this, indeed, can be seen in the Moldovan context, where Moldova has today expelled a Russian diplomat after the Kremlin opened polling stations for its presidential election in the breakaway region of Transnistria. quote, the Moldovan state expressed its protest against the presidential elections held by Russia in that region against the Moldovan authorities' stance. A diplomat was declared persona non grata, a spokesman for the Moldovans said. Meanwhile, back in the European Union, debates are ongoing over Ukrainian food. Ukrainian farmers will continue, we learn, to get tariff-free access to European markets until June 2025, albeit with new limits on imports of grains. The European Commission proposed in January to suspend duties and quotas on Ukrainian farm produce for a further year, with an emergency break for poultry, eggs and sugar, leading to tariffs if imports exceed the average levels of 2022 and 2023. Bear with me here, I know this is a bit detailed, but this really matters in the European financial context. However, of course, after months of protests from farmers over EU environmental rules and cheap imports, EU lawmakers pushed to extend the emergency list to other farm produce and add 2021 as a reference year. This was before, of course, Russia's invasion, when Ukrainian exports to the EU were curbed by tariffs and quotas. Negotiators for the European Parliament and the Belgian EU presidency agreed in the early hours of today to add oats, maize, groats and honey to the list, while keeping the limit as the average of 2022 and 2023 imports. So, in summary, some good news, some concessions for the Ukrainians, but some also financial implications from that. Neither side have got completely what they want. Interestingly, when measured in the geopolitical context, France backed this proposal, something they had not before, with Paris swinging behind Poland following Macron's meeting with Donald Tusk on Friday, promising French farmers before that he would protect them from imports after tractors besieged Paris earlier this year. As you can imagine, this has caused some anger in light of Macron's extraordinary remarks last week about nothing being off the table in his country's support of Ukraine. As one EU diplomat told the Telegraph, the most cynical thing about this is the two member states leading the charge on these restrictions in the food context, Poland and France, are the two that are the most vocal in saying we must do everything to help Ukraine. Macron is ready to send troops, but he is not ready to set up tractors, they added. So is it time for Francophile Francis to hang up his beret and put the onions away? I did say we would have to focus on deeds, not words, in the French context, but I'm willing to keep the costume on a little longer until we see what Paris does for Ukraine in the coming days and weeks. Despite this deal, Ukraine's Prime Minister Schmeichel has welcomed the fact an interim EU plan on these farm imports has been reached, saying it would allow Ukraine to support its producers and maintain its export levels. Schmeichel is currently in Brussels, and he says that he expects the arrangements to be agreed by the Parliament next month. Now, as an aside, just before we wrap up here, fleshing out the policy first proposed pushed by Kyiv and London, Josep Borrell, the European Union foreign policy chief, has said he will propose that the EU uses 90% of the revenues from Russian assets frozen in Europe to buy arms for Ukraine. So he, being the EU's top diplomat, told reporters he will propose that the remaining 10% be transferred to the EU budget to be used to boost the capacity of the Ukrainian defence industry. He said he'd submit that proposal to EU member states on Wednesday ahead of a summit on Thursday and Friday. Again, I know it's all a bit complicated in the financial and economic spheres at the moment, but this would potentially, again, be impactful. It really matters in the short and the long term for Ukraine's economic integration in Europe, as well as, of course, trying to find financial solutions to the weapons crisis that Dom has been talking about today. And just lastly, Donald Trump gave an exclusive interview to GB News last night. In a conversation with Nigel Farage, he reiterated his belief that he can negotiate with Putin and doubled down on his NATO critique about spending, although he eventually agreed that the US would back member states providing that they paid their bills. Still, despite his saying that, given the hostile framing of these remarks about NATO, it will hardly assuage those anxious about what he might do if he wins the presidency. But at least Europe has, in the last few weeks, woken up to the feasibility of that now. And on that, more from James, I believe.
Well, thank you very much, Francis and Dom, for all of that. Yes, let's go to our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. James, there's just one story to talk about from Germany today, but it's a rather interesting one. Why is Germany's Air Force ordering US cruise missiles? Tell us about this.
Yes, Daniel, that's right. Quite an interesting story that's come out of German media on a reported order for the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, of 75 US cruise missiles. Very expensive, reported to be costing about 8 billion euros. That, of course, will be part of an effort to build up the defences of Berlin as it braces for what Boris Pistorius, the German defence minister, has said could be a Russia-NATO war within the next 5 to 8 years. However, what's very interesting about this story is not so much the fact that some missiles are being bought, but a line in Bild tabloid, the newspaper which reported this deal, which says that these US cruise missiles, they're called JASSMs, JASM-ER, might, Bild sources say, be used to replace Taurus missiles. Now, that raises, of course, a very interesting question. Why might Germany be looking to replace its stocks of Taurus missiles? That suggests, of course, that those Taurus missiles might be going to a different country. And we know that there's been a heated discussion for many months now about the potential of Taurus missiles being delivered to Ukraine. Now, we all know that Olaf Scholz has repeatedly and vociferously said that he's not going to send Taurus missiles to Ukraine. He's refused to do that time and time again. He's reiterated that position very recently, and he does seem unlikely to change it. However, as Ukraine podcast listeners will be aware, there have been rumours in Germany of something called a Ringtausch, a sort of creative solution to the Taurus issue. Now, that would be an arrangement supposedly whereby Germany sends Taurus missiles to the UK in turn sends Storm Shadow missiles on the way to Ukraine. This allows Germany to indirectly provide more long-range missiles to Ukraine via the UK. It's not a great solution. We all know that the whole point of Kyiv asking for Taurus missiles is that they're much more powerful than Storm Shadows, but it does potentially get Olaf Scholz around that red line that he's stated so many times now about not directly sending the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Now, all of this has raised some speculation and a great deal of curiosity in Germany about the real reason that Germany is buying these JASSM missiles. And of course, it's led to some rumour and speculation that the real reason they're being bought perhaps is, as Bild reports, they are going to replace Taurus missiles, which may in turn go somewhere else. Now, we don't know where they might go. And as I've already said, Mr. Scholz seems pretty clear that he doesn't want them to go to Ukraine. But if they were, as part of that Ringtausch agreement, to go to the UK, that would indirectly lead to more Storm Shadow missiles for Ukrainian forces who urgently need them. So that's the main defence story from Germany. And my apologies, David, I believe I may have erroneously referred to you as Daniel at the top of that. So please forgive me for that.
Please don't worry, John. It's absolutely fine. Can you tell us a little bit about the reaction in Germany, the press reaction, the reaction on the street? What's your sense of how ordinary Germans are reacting to this news? And this, as you said, it was reported in a tabloid originally.
Yes, that's right. Ordinary Germans are actually very split on this issue. It depends on who you speak to. I see a bit of a generational divide here. On the whole, if I talk to older Germans, they tend to bring up the sort of usual excuses, of course, that you might expect. The reluctance for Germany to ever be a Kriegspartei or party to the war. That's due to obvious 20th century history involving World War II, essentially. And if you speak to younger Germans, it could be argued a little bit more hawkish. They recognise that Germany is moving into a position where it needs to be a major security power in Europe. And that means playing an active role in the defence of Europe as a whole. And many of them recognise that defending Ukraine is exactly the same as defending Europe now. And the destinies of European defence and Ukrainian defence are closely intertwined. And therefore, they put the argument forward that you shouldn't just be sending money to Ukraine, which is of course, what Germany already does in very large sums, but it needs to play a much more involved role on defence. There's another discussion about Taurus missiles doing the rounds in Germany, which is people trying to puzzle out the real reason that Mr. Scholz doesn't want to send them. Now, recently, Olaf Scholz did come out with another reason that he won't send them on top of the previous ones, which included nuclear escalation, among others. But more recently, Mr. Scholz said at a gathering of voters, a kind of round table meeting, if you like, with German voters, he said that his big concern about the Taurus missile is that it's got enough range to strike Moscow. He appeared to be raising the concern that if the Ukrainians were to receive Taurus missiles, they might essentially blow up the Kremlin. Now, it's really important to remember that one of the interesting things about these deals that European countries have done with Ukraine is that it is strongly suspected that if a weapon system is given to Ukraine, there tends to be an understanding that there will be very close coordination between the country that sent it, for example, the United Kingdom, and Ukraine. And that means that critics of Mr. Scholz say he doesn't really have a leg to stand on when he expresses concerns about how the Ukrainians might use the system. They say that in practice, Germany would probably have a very strong say, perhaps even a veto, on exactly what targets might be selected. And so in summary, unfortunately, that's a sort of roundabout way of saying that we're back to where we started on Taurus missiles at the beginning of 2024, which is a definitive no from Scholz that doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon, but some rumours perhaps of a sort of backup solution to the Taurus issues, such as the Ringtausch that we mentioned moments ago.
Thank you so much, James. Just one question from me before we go to our final thoughts. I think listeners are fairly familiar now with exactly why the Support for Ukraine bill is held up in the US and how it's progressing and how it's been stopped in Congress. What's the situation in Germany? How exactly do these support packages get passed? And are we looking at in Germany a similar sort of deadlock with various ideas? I mean, I know there's been a series of votes where things are not voted through and things are voted down even. But what's the political scene here? How do things get through? And what does the parliament look like in terms of support for Ukraine?
So, an interesting question. Definitely not as febrile, I would say, as the situation in the United States. Now, there have been issues in the German parliament where types of support have been voted down. And the most recent example of that, of course, would be last week when a motion was brought to the Bundestag on sending missiles to Ukraine. That was an opposition motion, which is significant, brought by the CDU. And German MPs almost overwhelmingly really voted against sending Taurus missiles to Ukraine on that count. Now, many of the people who voted no in that motion were voting no for symbolic reasons. They didn't like the idea that an opposition party would try to sort of bounce the government into doing something that it's already said it won't do. It nonetheless creates the strong impression, of course, that many MPs don't want Taurus missiles to go to Ukraine. And that's not necessarily the case. If you look at some of the statements coming out of the opposition CDU, Norbert Röttgen is one particularly prominent voice. They are actually keen on getting the Taurus missiles over there because they recognise how important they are. But on the specific question about funding, it really hasn't been as rocky a road as it has been for the United States, I think it's fair to say. The Germans continue to announce some very large funding packages. I believe it was €500 million in funding for Ukraine that was announced by Boris Pistorius yesterday. But there is a slight concern about the ongoing issues with the German budget. Without getting too much into the weeds of the German budget crisis over here, late last year, a constitutional court issued a ruling that basically said that the German government cannot use pandemic-era funds for future projects. That created an enormous hole in the German budget for multiple spending years going forward. There was a big panic, a big crisis. What's going to happen to the financial support for Ukraine? And the German government kind of managed to stitch up the issue and has figured out immediate funding. But there is a longer-term question in terms of whether Ukrainian, or rather German support for Ukraine in financial terms will be as generous as it's always been. But on the whole, I would say that the situation is not looking quite as gloomy as it seems to be over in the United States.
Well, thank you so much, James, for talking us through that. That was really fascinating and answered quite a few questions that have been bubbling in my mind for a while. So thank you. It's really good to have you back on the podcast. Coming up, we hear Dom, Francis and James's final thoughts and Dom's interview with Roman Kostenko. Let's go now to our final thoughts. We'll go, I think, in order: Dom, then James, then Francis. Dom Nicholls, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, David. So a bit of a plug, but not for us, so that's all right. The Open University here in the UK, under their Disabled Veterans Scholarship Scheme, is offering a fully sponsored, fully paid for, free bachelor's or master's degree for injured or disabled veterans. 50 places available. Apply by 10th of July. Eligibility criteria is you just need to be ordinarily resident in the UK and disabled as a result of or in military service. Disabled not just physically. So, calling all veterans, if you want to have a go at the OU, get a free degree, go and have a look at their website. Looks like a pretty good opportunity. Thanks, David. Bit of a plug.
Thank you very much, Dom. James from Berlin, your final thoughts, please.
Yes, well, I'll just respond to a question that's come through from a listener who was responding to the points I made just earlier. Ian Clark, who's listening to the Telegraph's podcast, said, how are Taurus missiles more powerful than Storm Shadow? As reporter just said, I thought they had a longer range. Do they have a bigger warhead too? And just to clarify, Ian, I was talking about the range in the sense that the Taurus missiles do have a considerably longer range than the Storm Shadow missiles. They can therefore hit targets much further away. That specifically is why Olaf Scholz is concerned about them. And just one more point to add about missiles in general. It's been reported that these other missiles that Germany is looking to buy potentially to replace Taurus, the Jassam-ER missiles, they've got an even longer range than the Taurus. That's estimated to be somewhere in the region of at least 900 kilometres in range and possibly even further. So in short, we are talking about long-range missiles, which in terms of what happens at the destination, in terms of the explosion, perhaps it could be argued is relatively similar, but the range is the key difference in terms of the differences between these different types of weapons.
Thank you very much, Dom and James. Francis Dearnley to finish the episode.
Thanks, David. As we've said many times, in our requirement to assess this war in the abstract, it can be very easy to lose sight of the human faces behind the statistics of losses on the front line. As such, I wanted to end by quoting from a piece called A Toast to My Fallen Friends in Donbas by Asami Terajima of the Kyiv Independent. She describes getting to know one unit of soldiers and later how three of the unit's members, Commander Alexander and two others, Vlad and Artem, were killed in a brutal Russian anti-tank missile attack in the early morning of November 19th, 2023. As she writes, Vlad would never experience another summer day scrolling through Instagram with a cigarette in hand, sporting a grey t-shirt and stretched out black shorts. Alexander, who cared so much about his soldiers, would be killed on the spot. This great man, with the brightest blue eyes and the biggest heart, the kind of empathetic commander that every soldier wanted to lead them. As we ate the grilled skewers this February, Vitaly said that even though he pulled Alexander's body, he couldn't process the reality of his commander's death. Vlad, who had stood the closest to the van that was struck by Russian forces, was unrecognisable. Another friend who used to sleep beside Vlad at the base collected his charcoal body parts, almost losing consciousness himself. It was not Vlad, the friend told me. I tried to remind myself that it's extremely lucky that Vlad, Alexander and Artem's bodies were retrieved. The destroyed van still stands there, reminding my friends of the horror each time they pass it on their way to the position. It hurts me greatly to see the families of missing soldiers still believe that their loved ones might be alive and held in Russian captivity because there's no evidence, a body, to prove they were killed in action. Sami concludes the piece by saying something we've heard again and again the past 2 years. As a child, I always used to fear death and was scared about the concept that I cried to my mum because there was no way to prevent it. I was terrified of what would happen after death. Now, at the age of 23, I understand that death is just another reminder that every moment is precious because it could be your last. The way we survive war is to be as comfortable as possible with that uncertainty. It's a moving piece, David, and we'll add a link to it in the show notes to this episode.
Thank you very much, Francis. And just to say as well, Asami is one of there's a whole host of fantastic young journalists reporting from the front lines. I would hugely recommend following her on Twitter and reading her pieces on the Kyiv Independent, along with her colleagues.
So, Colonel Roman Kostenko, thank you so much for talking to Ukraine the latest. You were a colonel in the SBU, you served in Alpha Group, you fought in Donetsk in 2014, you fought elsewhere in Ukraine. Then in 2019 you were elected to Parliament here, and you currently serve as the Secretary of the Parliamentary Committee on National Security, Defence and Intelligence. Essentially, as I understand it, in layman's terms, in easy terms, your day job is effectively to be the eyes and ears of the Land Forces commander. You go and visit units, brigades, divisions, look at how they are prepared for the fight and see where improvements could be made.
Якраз мій пріоритет тому, я маю пріоритет тому, що я
My advantage is that I am both a military guy, I often stay directly on the ground together with soldiers during their performance, and I work at Ukraine's parliament, the National Secretary, Defence and Intelligence Committee, so I understand what's going on the strategic level. So knowing what's happening on the battlefield and politics gives me an opportunity to be more realistic about a lot of things.
Розумію, що відбувається в політиці, то всі ці знання дають мені можливість більш реально дивитися на речі.
I will touch at the end, if I may, a bit more on the strategic or the parliamentary side. I would like to talk for the most part of this interview about the tactical preparation of Ukrainian armed forces at the moment. So I'm going to start from the ground up, basically. There's a lot of talk at the moment about the bill in Congress, the money in Congress, and a lot of talk about the shortage of artillery shells. But I think it is much broader than that. If I can start with training, please. Basic training, as I understand it, is 4 weeks long for those that are drafted into the military. How can that be satisfactory given the fight that you are now in?
Ну, звичайно, недостатньо, тому що я сам як офіцер спецпідрозділів, ми завжди...
Of course, 4 weeks is not enough. Me as a special subdivisions officer always try to train our soldiers properly. Guys from our Alpha Group used to say that a soldier can participate in operations after 5 years of work in a subdivision.
Це умови війни, і, звичайно, ми розуміємо, що нема скільки часу...
Though it's wartime right now, and we realize that we've not got that much time to spend on training. Still, I believe that we need to increase the training period. Moreover, I have already submitted a bill stating that the training period of soldiers should last at least 3 months. Besides, this bill includes information about the minimum amount of ammunition each soldier must fire and weapons they have to use, because the preparation often depends on the training center that soldiers train at.
Солдат має мінімально вистрілити боєприпасів.
It happens that commanders at those centers abuse their duties that entails poor training. At the moment, we are working on the requirements added to the bill on the shooting practice, applying various equipment, plus an exam determining which soldier is allowed to take part in combat action or not. These 3 months are just for training of a young recruit. After that, every soldier should be trained according to a speciality of work that they're supposed to perform. A tanker, a javelin operator, etc. Such sort of training must be performed separately, and a soldier can be allowed to the battlefield only after passing it.
I trained recruits for a year in my military service, and our basic training was 11 weeks up to that, to take them to that phase 1 standard. And at that standard, they were capable. We only took them up to the level of doing what we call pairs, fire and movement. So being able to look after yourself, look after your weapon, and operate with one other person. That was the level of basic training, and we took 11 weeks to do that. So what you're describing is a huge uplift in the whole training pipeline. Are you still able to do that in the model of support from external countries, of moving recruits out of the country for all the administration that entails, and then bring them back after training? Do you think training should be moved inside Ukraine?
Це навчання не вийде, тому що тут ми маємо розуміти спроможності наші щодо навчання на території України.
The whole training cannot be conducted only on Ukraine's territory, since we have to take into account our capabilities to do that. It is much safer to train our soldiers abroad, and we are very grateful to our partners for helping us with that, for training our defenders. From the point of view of safety, training taking place abroad is definitely better. We also have problems regarding ammunition or weaponry to train our soldiers with. Based on my own experience, my soldiers were trained in England and Spain, so I can say that the training was decent. It included great shooting practice, including usage of grenades. Of course, they managed to get better experience since we usually run short on ammunition because of the size of our army. The main issue that remains at the moment is that our partners can often provide just individual training for soldiers, so they can learn to operate as part of a group just on their arrival back in Ukraine. You understand what I mean, working as part of a military company or section.
And that level of training, when it's above the individual, if you like, how might that model be built? Do you think there's a role here, for example, for either Western uniformed forces, which would be a big political decision, but there are other ways, for example, veterans groups, Western veterans? Do you think there's a potential there for a model with Western veterans working inside Ukraine, training at that level?
Взагалі, звичайно, можливо, і це була б дуже крута ідея.
It is possible. It would be a cool idea to realize. At the moment, our soldiers used almost all of the equipment that is at NATO's disposal. Sometimes training abroad is not enough for soldiers to learn to use the equipment at its maximum level. They have to keep training here on the ground, often needing some more guidance from those who know more. When the war was unfolding, and we trained on a lot of equipment like machine guns and laws, British volunteers, guys from the International Legion, helped us on the shooting range and taught us how to use them. I personally asked them to train guys from my division since we didn't know how to use the weapons that we'd gotten. We've got a training program for the soldiers to learn abroad. When it comes to veterans who participated in hostilities and had experience, I, as a military guy, understand that if we had professionals here on the ground who would help us, would significantly increase the effectiveness of the weapons provided.
And rather than just hoping that individuals decide, yeah, I'll go and help Ukraine, would you look to the governments, international NATO or EU members, or both, to actually have a formulated plan to reach out to the veteran community to try and organise this group you've just described?
Да, зараз дійсно програма у нас є, коли ми тренуємося за кордоном.
Often our tankers who are being trained, for instance in Germany, they learn just the basics and use some 30% of Leopard's, Challengers or any other tank's capabilities.
Я як військовий, я розумію, і коли ми маємо професіоналів тут на полі бою, які б нам тут допомагали.
If they had someone here by their side who would help them train in the period when they don't participate in combat activities, we'd be able to increase this percentage. It would even give us a chance to use less equipment, but to greater effect.
Дало б нам можливість навіть використовувати менше техніки, але те, що є, більш результативно.
Just finally on training, as I said at the beginning, everyone seems to be focused on artillery shells at the moment for the front. Are you getting enough small arms ammunition, air defense simulators, anti-tank simulators to train on? Was it all going straight to the front?
Я, до речі, також це прописав в своєму законопроекті. Це якраз те, що...
I also added this point to my bill, realizing that we are short on ammunition even for conducting training on simulators.
Використовувати саме симулятори. І, до речі, я знаю, що...
By the way, I know that Great Britain has simulators that allow them to simultaneously train whole military sections. I know that we need at least 20 simulators like this to be delivered to our training centers.
Я знаю, що в нас є потреба не менше там...
It would facilitate training of our defenders and spare ammunition for the actual combat actions. This is very important. We have to technologically move up to new training methods. This is rather demanding, so I also included that into my bill.
Це складно, я навіть прописав це в своєму законопроекті, як я казав.
Thank you. So moving away from training onto the operations at the moment, in terms of the fortifications along the line of contact, Russia spent an awful lot of time and used civilian labour digging what's known as the Surovkin line. Why is there not the equivalent on the Ukrainian side, a Zaluzhny line, if you like?
Зараз ми вже почали будувати лінію оборони, і я дійсно вважаю це.
These days we have finally started fortifying our defence lines. I believe it was our fault that we didn't start doing it earlier. Russia's approach towards this is better.
Це взагалі складне питання, і
It's actually a rather intricate question, and it's rather difficult to answer. I think that generally Ukrainian forces counted on more maneuvered actions and the defence was just underestimated. I personally insisted on building up a good defence, and only after that to initiate offensive actions to be 100% sure that we wouldn't retreat and preserve the territory that had been won back. Unfortunately, Ukrainian forces have just started doing this, and I hope we will manage to finish fortifying before the enemy starts advancing.
My experience from the British Army is that digging and fortifying is not a passive act. It's not as if you are saying, that's it, I'm now going to stay here and wait for you to arrive on my position. It is the very first thing you do as part of an offensive act. Do you think that sort of way of warfare is inculcated or is in Ukrainian military doctrine? Or is it still thought of as digging and holding a line is seen as I'm no longer interested in going forward?
Тут питання в тому, що ми всі розуміємо, що якщо зараз закопатися і стояти просто в глухій...
All of us realize that if we just sit down in trenches and stand on the defensive, the opponent will start to advance.
Потрібні активні дії і...
That is why active actions are required to intercept the initiative on any front. These are military basics to be followed. Regarding the question how to act, our Commander-in-Chief, Syrski, said that defenders shouldn't just stand on the defensive. I think this is our doctrine. Even if we stand on a defensive on some front, active actions should take place on the other one to impose our initiative to the enemy.
Could I talk to you about the unmanned systems force, drones? It seems to me that at the tactical and operational level now, you can no longer achieve mass and surprise. If you mass a force, they will see a dozen tanks congregating. Are you still able to launch an attack given the number of drones, or do you now have to deal with the drones first?
Зараз дрони зайняли одну з самих найважливіших ніж взагалі на полі бою.
Today, drones have occupied one of the most important spaces on the battlefield. They overpower even artillery in regard to eliminating equipment. Of course, artillery has its value, though drones have come to the fore concerning inflicting hits on military hardware. The event that happened recently, there was a column of Russian equipment that couldn't even reach its firing positions since it was destroyed by FPV drones. Drones are rather effective at the moment and help us sustain this military balance with Russia, even though our partners don't provide enough equipment for us. So we can keep this parity with the Russians. I'm going to tell you a story about my subdivision. The last time I used Javelin was in summer 2022. Guys from my subdivision eliminated more than 500 units of Russian equipment. The major part of it was destroyed at a distance of not less than 5 to 7 kilometers, and it can't even come close to our sideline. Today it's a rare situation when a grenade, a javelin or a machine gun is used to destroy a tank. The drones do it instead. The focal priority is to keep the enemy farther from our lines. This war is a new one. The drones split the distance and help save lives. But for the drones, Ukraine's manpower losses would be much higher.
Time is marching on, so two more questions, if I may, at the strategic level, the political level. The West, shorthand for external supporters of Ukraine, could do a lot more. They could supply more ammunition, they could supply more training equipment, they could put uniformed people in Ukraine for training, they could encourage veterans, as we've discussed. I won't ask any specifics about those things, but generally, do you think the West is taking enough risk at the moment in its support for Ukraine?
Я вважаю, що країни Заходу повинні безпосередньо воювати на території України I
think Western countries must personally participate in the combat actions on the territory of Ukraine, because they have to understand that this aggression is not just a war of Russia against Ukraine. This is the war of the civilized world against dictatorship, and this is obvious.
Це стосується тільки України, і навіть в питанні наданні зброї часто
Though the West often behaves as if this war concerns just Ukraine, and often keeps bargaining as to what kind of weapons to provide for Ukraine.
Цивілізований світ, то зараз ми бачимо, що відбувається.
When we mention the civilized world, we see what's happening right now. Our ally, the US, doesn't provide any aid for us. Europe keeps pondering over the numbers of tanks to give us.
Велика коаліція всіх танків.
I'll remind you of the big tank coalition that was arranged before Ukraine's counteroffensive. Nearly 4,000 tanks were on the battlefield, while the whole coalition provided for us just 50 Leopard tanks and 14 Challengers. That's all that was given to us by the tank coalition.
Трошки більше, по-моєму, 14 челенджерів. Це все, що нам надала танкова коаліція.
There were so many talks about provisions of missiles that have proven to be effective in Ukraine, but they aren't supplied in sufficient quantities. While in Russia, without any voting by the parliament, North Korea supplies ammunition and weaponry, Iran delivers Shahed drones and ballistic missiles, and China helps Russia evade sanctions. That is, dictatorship states do more for their allies than the civilized world that keeps saying it aims to protect the planet. Though when it comes to supplies for Ukraine, we can just hear more blah 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 than real actions.
Але для того, щоб щось нам надати, вони, скажімо, більше розмов, ніж діла.
From your position in Parliament, how would you characterise the mood of the government at the moment?
Парламент, він виконує свої функції парламенту.
The parliament performs its functions. Part of the presidential party and fraction implementing orders by the president of Ukraine undiscussed, and the opposition tries to be a so-called safeguard from wrong decisions.
Опозиція, яка намагається бути цим запобіжником від
Generally speaking, the parliament is functional, though we wish it worked better.
Працює. Звичайно, хотілося б краще, але ми не можемо працювати, тому що
Often it's risky to even stay in the building of the parliament for too long, since a missile launched from Belarusian or Russian territory can reach it within 2 to 3 minutes, and we are realistic that the Russians can target Ukraine's parliament as well.
Росіяни можуть також завдати удари по парламенту.
What would be your message to Western leaders?
Ті дії, які вони зараз, як зараз виглядає допомога Україні,
The way they are aiding Ukraine these days puts them at risk of remaining in world's history as indecisive leaders.
Я бажаю їм бути більш рішучими.
I wish them to be more decisive and accept this challenge as the one not just Ukraine, but the whole civilized world should face and take action. I wish them to be braver in their actions towards the Russian Federation.
Що стосується Російської Федерації.
Roman Kostenko, thank you very much for talking to Ukraine the Latest.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.